Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Historia Politica Pública. In the episode of today, I will talk about the history, this idea of heritage, as a kind of contraposition against the modern times, how the idea of tradition of heritage has been used in order to kind of establish a distinction between a romanticized past and the current trends of modern times. So, for instance, the word heritage, which is widely used in the Anglo-Saxon world, it can be conceptualized as a kind of poetical word that means liberties, privilege, and immunities, like in the essay written by Raphael Samuel, which is called Theatres of Memory, kind of to define people chosen by God. In that sense, Baldwin, the British politician in 1934, used the word heritage in order to counterfact fascism or to challenge, it was used before to challenge the royal prerogative during the 17th centuries, what is was commonly known as the Commons Enclosure, in which the power of the states at that time, the feudal system, was closing the public spaces which were used before for the peasant and the common people in order to kind of grow their own fields, cultivate the foods, and so on. So heritage has always used to kind of establish a difference between the modern currents. Fascism in 1934 as a kind of radical change of society, and Baldwin wanted to preserve the British past. In that sense, Raphael Samuel speaks about invented traditions in order to defend the city's liberties and the laws, and how this is something that we can hear nowadays in our common day conversation, this kind of nostalgia for a kind of romanticized past in which it is commonly heard that the previous years were much better than now, society is now in decay, in corruption. This has always happened in all times of history, this kind of reminding of their own past as a kind of idealized time. But the thing is, like, when you think of something about the past, you tend to forget the painful memories and rather focus on the kind of positive aspects of those years. This has a problem because idealizing the past too much, it can bring you back to some kind of era in which there was less rights, everything was more backwards in some sense. It is true that there are some kind of current innovation in modern society that are without any doubt nocive for our health, such as the pollution of these societies, different use of technology that are kind of alienating ourselves from the others. But at the same time, it is worth to admit the kind of progress being made in the last 200 years, especially regarding to social rights, but also with the advance of technologies, the kind of health system in our societies, and so on. The increasing of the public education, public health, roads, or other kind of different mechanism that has been created in the last 2 centuries. But the thing is, like, obviously this kind of reactionary movement tend to praise too much the past in order to go back to a time in which the power, not just the kind of political power, but also the hegemony was established to favor a kind of tiny minority in society. It is something that is happening also nowadays, but still people have the feeling that the system is unfair, unlikely as 200 years or 300 years before, when all the movements suddenly start to outburst. But the thing is, like, the use of the past has, as Hosbon mentioned, used to kind of regret your history in the terms that favor your approach. So the idea of heritage, according to Raphael Samuel, by the way, was one of the most important British historians about public history. This idea of bringing the history to the common people, to the people from below. There are many examples of that, like when you go to a museum, when you go to a city and you take like a tour, there is a person who is explaining to you directly how the history of society has develop the kind of current times. And this is important because it's a kind of a counter position against the kind of academic historians which allegedly are living in their ivory tower, as it's been said, and are just producing for academic journals which at the end the common people won't read those. They are too dense for the majority of people, but if you create a space of public history in which people can listen to you and you can tell to them without too much jargon and speaking a kind of more direct language, it will help a history to gain an interest among people. This happened with the documentaries, for instance, the activities that you perform in the public sphere, such as like an action of some historical events and so on. And this is something that in the last 30-40 years have gained a huge approach, especially with the idea of, again, public history for the people. There are many books very interesting: History of the People of the World by Chris Harman, History of the People of the United States by Howard Zinn, The History of the People of London by John Rees and Lindsay German, and many others. This idea of, because you are telling the history of the people, it is good also to tell the history of those people. So heritage was created in 1920s. Anthropologists use the concept of heritage to dignify their selection from the writers and the poets. There is also this idea of the heritage of India, a kind of tribute to the antiquity of Indian civilization. Edward Thompson was one of the writers, and he was a follower of Tagore, one of the most important philosophers in India and one of the greatest figures of the 20th century of that country, alongside with Gandhi and some others. And obviously he was the father of the great A.G. Thompson, who was a Marxist writer, writer who wrote a book about the working class in Britain, following a bit of the trend of the book written 200 years ago by Friedrich Engels about the working class in Manchester. The heritage is also kind of idea of nostalgia from the past, the lost England. Patrick Wright, another historian, mentioned that these tend to be aristocratic reactionary in character because it counterfacts the more progressive spirit of the post-war welfare state. So if Baldwin attacked fascism in 1934 using the word heritage against a totalitarian and hateful idea, this was used also after 1945, when the welfare state increased the right for a huge majority of people. In other words, the university was not anymore for a tiny elite, but rather for a significant amount of the population. It was considered that the previous time was much better, in which just there was a bunch of people who apparently were chosen by God, as Raphael Samuel point in that sense, that it was argued that like that. So we see how heritage can be used to remind of a past in which the millions of people were exploited openly, and henceforth are a kind of aristocratic reactionary to go back to the past. The country house was seen as, according to Raphael Samuel, as a potent symbol of everything that was threatened by modernization and reform. In other words, as a counterattack to the modern world, these kind of books were common in the UK during the end of the Second World War. There was these dreams of post-war construction. Could it be possible to come back to the ancient times? It was a kind of debate at that time. There was an idea of a paradise lost, the countryside in England, which in the United Kingdom, the green landscape is absolutely beautiful. There are huge spaces, and obviously the aristocratic people had their castles or the lodgings, the big houses are around there. And they felt that something was being lost for them, which obviously they were right, because for them, they had to adapt to current times in which there will be more equality for the people, and henceforth they could not exploit the others in the kind of explicit way as they had been doing for many centuries. In that sense, in order, and this is very interesting that Rafael Samuel points, in order to kind of enhance this idea of the heritage of the countryside, there were programs of radio after 1945 to show the noises of nature, to praise heritage. This is very important. It is not just through books or even through kind of debates, but also using the noises in nature to bring people, at least spiritually, to nature, which I think is a beautiful idea, to stay alongside nature, to kind of keep this synergy and harmony with the environment, but at the same time understanding that every person has the right for do so. And in London, for instance, it is very interesting city, because there are many great parks across the city, like Hampstead Heath in the north, Regent's Park not very far from that, Primrose Hill nearby, Hyde Park, also you have Victoria Park, St James Park, many others which are kind of distributed in the city to make people that live around go there for a walk, kind of meditate, enjoy and embrace nature. And I think this is very important. To even you are living in a city, you don't have to cut yourself from your upbringing into nature. And I think this is very important for us to keep the idea that the ecology is fundamental for the survival, not just for other species, but also for our own kind of humankind. The conservation crystallized as a reformist cause and campaigning cry after the Second World War, when the post-war expansion of the economy was carrying prosperity to new heights. There was the Royal World Preservation, the romance of these themes. There was, for example, in Islington, I remember 2 years ago, I was walking by, there was a campaign to preserve trees that were near the station. They were building there, and because those trees had more than a century of life, they were being thought to be preserved. Also in Hampstead Heath, I was told years ago that it was an idea to build a McDonald's inside the beautiful great park, but the people organized a campaign to oppose that idea, and after that they kind of surrender, and the McDonald's was never built inside the park. You find like two small coffee shops inside just for the walkers and so on, but still it is an unspoiled place to go and relax among the nature. In fact, there was also outrage in the 1950s, 1960s, as Rafael Samuel points, against this idea of destroying many trees and creating different buildings. There was a criticism of the forest, of traffic signs in place of edge and trees. How this is very interesting. This idea of the traffic light was substituting the trees within the different roads in the United Kingdom, and this created a huge outburst of rage among the population. It was also criticized the giganticism through the Nature Conservation Act of 1970, that was a huge growth of local amenity societies like wildlife trusts, and this was very important because it seems that for 1945 to 1960s, this was this idea of reconstructing after post-war period, and there were some people who believed that they were taking too much on that reason. It was good to create a welfare state, but still, the nature had to be still kept. And I think in United Kingdom they have done a great job about that. There are places where you cannot build kind of buildings and so on, and henceforth there are many trees, there are animals around there. In London there is Richmond Park, where you have deers and many other species in different areas. Economically, the growth of conservationist sentiment seems to relate closely to the remarkably spread of home ownership. This is interesting because, according to Rafael Samuel, in 1961 there were 29% of people in United Kingdom who had homes. But in nowadays, well, or where he wrote this article some decades ago, it was 65%. Like, he argues that because people own much more houses later on, they also wanted to keep the kind of idea of a British society embracing nature with a lot of trees around the cities, not just in the countryside, but very close to them. Because if they had to emigrate from the countryside to the city, they did not want to leave everything behind. So it was important to keep themselves alongside nature. And it is very important that the cities take account of that situation, how, according to the scientists, the nature is very important for us. It helps us to breathe more pure oxygen. The trees are perfect to that because they kind of spread the oxygen among the areas, and they take from themselves the dioxide of carbon, the carbon dioxide, because that is unhealthy for the humans. And so there was a part of this was the counterculture of the 1960s, the student revolt, the kind of workers protests, and so on. One part of this movement was the idea of going back to nature, and there was a creation of organic food, organic farms, and as emerged as an alternative lifestyle. Nowadays, we see that the vegan movement is expanding widely across the world for this idea to preserving the nature. So the idea of saving the environment has always been in the minds of the humans, and the social movement that has been created in the last decades are a kind of epitome of this approach in order to preserve the integrity of the nature. There was also a democratic intention. This is something that I have been talking in the episode. The access to nature, the multiplication of public footpaths, and assertion of public rights over private property, and so on. The case of Hampstead Heath is very interesting because there was a huge fight in the 19th century that was much before of this kind of wildflowers and so on, but it was a kind of pioneer. The thing is, like, the whole Hampstead Heath, that is a huge park in North London, was owned by just one person who has a private enclosure for that, and the people were demanding access to that. He was against that, and they were to trial and so on. But the thing is, like, this person, the owner of Hampstead Heath, of the area, he died in 1871, and from that year on, the public Hampstead Heath, the park became public, open for the public. And in 2021, they did like the 150th anniversary, in order to commemorate those 150 years in which people has been able to kind of disconnect from the frenziness of the cities and just relax in the nature. And there were pictures from that times, writers like Keats or Orwell have been writing alongside the park. Orwell was living very close to Hampstead Heath. Other people like Karl Marx live in Hampstead Heath and used to go with his granddaughters and grandchildren on Sunday to Hampstead Heath, and the rest of the family, Friedrich Engels, Eleanor Marx, and many other people. So has always been a hub of people from different classes, ideologies to gather there. And this is very important, and nowadays you have a lot of public footpath there and in the other parks in London. So, and I will finish here the episode. To sum up, the idea of heritage, which was used also as a kind of reactionary trend, has always employed for a more progressive measures in order to establish a democratic city in which all the people could have right to engage in nature. That was not anymore a kind of privilege for the elite, but also nowadays in the United Kingdom, you can go to any park, it's for free, take a coffee there and have a nice day, enjoy with your friends, see the different species, the ducks, the birds, the squirrels going around there, and it will help you to the well-being, and I think it's a fundamental part of the area. The 48% of the City of London, of the space, is green space, according to a report that was released some years ago. So this is a kind of idea that in the city, this kind of engaging with nature is being done quite well.